The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Aubrey McLaughlin, and I am the Director of Alumni Professional Networks for the University of Maryland's Alumni Association. We are excited that you're able to join us for today's webinar, Write Better Agile Stories, presented by Cynthia Kahn, Smith School Bachelor's and MBA graduate from the class of 1981 and 1985, and Gerri Slama Grove, Smith School MBA graduate from 1985. This webinar is part of the Alumni Association's Professional Development Webinar Series, in which we hope to provide thought-provoking and valuable content that will help alumni like you achieve your personal and professional goals. We have a lot of information to cover today, but we will be taking questions throughout the duration of the webinar. Please feel free to submit any questions you have using the question box located in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will take them as they are submitted. Cynthia and Gerri met while earning their MBA at the Smith School of Business. Both Cynthia and Gerri have over 20 years experience, each managing both Agile and waterfall projects. In addition, both have earned their PMP and CSM. Cynthia is co-author of the GSD Scrum Handbook and co-founder of the Agile consulting company, GSD Mindset, where she teaches Scrum in day one and coaches teams as they transition to Agile, leaving their waterfall ways behind. Gerri joined GSD Mindset to bring the message to the East Coast. And now we will get started. Ladies, take it away.
Hi, I'm Cynthia.
Hi, I'm Gerri.
And people always ask us, what's GSD? What does that stand for? It basically stands for Get Stuff Done. I think Aubrey covered our background, but I would like to share a little bit about why we love Scrum. We love Scrum because the Agile mindset is a shift to focus on delivery and process improvements rather than completing tasks in a project plan. We love this shift to product ownership, and we just love getting more stuff done. April and I started GSD Mindset 3 years ago when we were frustrated by taking classes that taught more theory and no practical application that we could take back to our real world business. So hopefully today you'll get something you can use and you can take it back to your jobs. Before we get started, it's always helpful to know our audience. So one of the things we wanted to know is how agile you are. Do you consider yourself a beginner? Do you consider yourself intermediate? You've been doing it for a couple of years? Or are you a convert like myself and Gerri, and you couldn't go back if you tried? So Aubrey's going to collect those results and let us know.
Yes, so the options are up right now. So if you would just select the option that you are, we'll close this poll in about another couple of seconds here once we have the majority of attendees who have submitted a response. Okay, just another 5 seconds or so. And so we have 86% of the attendees that have voted, and it looks like we have the majority of people on the line are completely beginner, 68%. There's 28% who are intermediate, and there is 4% who is a 100% convert.
Okay, that's awesome. And some of our content overlaps what we talked about last week. And so I want to know if you attended last week, because I will then breeze through some of the content, but if most of you did not attend, then we will take it one step at a time.
Perfect. And so again, the survey is now up. If you can just select your responses. We'll leave this up for another couple of seconds here just to collect as many responses as we can. Okay. And so we have actually most of the people are joining us this week who are not a part of last week. So 79% of you were not on last week's webinar. It was an introductory webinar to Agile, and 21% are joining us from last week. So.
Okay, So we won't spend a lot of time, but we will still do the exercises that overlap. Today's agenda is, we've got a lot of information to cover, but we're really going to just talk about what is a story and how to plan for feature releases, which is what we talked about last week. We're going to talk about how to write stories with acceptance criteria and how to groom stories and assign story points. Most of you guys are new, so a lot of people, you hear about stories, but you don't know what a story is. And stories are pretty simple. They're a functional requirement that are written from the customer's point of view that has acceptance criteria that describes how to verify the finished product meets the requirement. Okay, so it looks really simple. Then why do most people find story writing to be the hardest thing that they do when they switch to Scrum? And we think it's because people who write stories don't properly organize their product requirements or their thoughts, so they don't know where to start or what to do first. I mean, writing a simple teeny tiny requirement it's really important to organize your thoughts just the same way as if you're writing a book or a story or a magazine. Our approach to story writing is like any writing exercise. Like I said, to write better stories, you need to be organized. You need to have your thoughts well organized too. To get better organized, the one thing that most people don't do, Scrum talks about planning, but they don't necessarily tell you how to plan. So you need to plan. The other thing that you need to do is write stories that not only talk about the requirement, but also include acceptance criteria. Another thing you need to do to get organized is to review the stories, which is what we call grooming stories, and assigning them a level of effort, which is called story points. So this is how you plan for epic and feature releases. Our approach to planning is a little bit unique because in Scrum, they talk about the fact that you need to plan on a quarterly basis, but they don't tell you how. What we do is plan for feature releases, which is a lot different than most traditional project managers who plan with tasks in a Microsoft project plan. So what we're going to go through today is identifying high-level components or use cases, talk about breaking down those epics into components, defining your minimum viable product, and creating a release plan. So the first thing that you need to do is figure out what you want to use for your epics. Epics are talked about in Scrum, but they're not really well defined. To me, I come from an object-oriented technical background, and I define in my mind an epic as a high-level use case. We like to use the banking application as a starting point, because everybody's used an online banking app or a mobile banking app. So if you're going to write your own banking app from scratch, let's take a couple seconds and Aubrey will read them off to me. But what banking app epics can you think of if you were going to write your own banking app? So these are the high level use cases. I'm going to document them here when she tells them to me.
Perfect. And so if you have any responses to Cynthia's prompt, please feel free to type them into the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel, and I can easily see them from there. So we do have one response that has been submitted already. It is a mobile deposit.
Okay, so just high level enough. Let's just call it deposit money. Okay.
Check balances.
Okay, so thinking about what epic that's coming from, so it would be some kind of, I guess, account statements or account transactions.
Secure connection.
Okay, so security in general would be a high-level epic that you would break down further.
Transfer money.
Okay, transfers, that's a big one.
Observe money flow.
I'm not sure if that's a transaction or a transfer, but okay, I will put that down, because when you start to break it down, sometimes you'll find out that your epic is actually a component of a larger epic that you'll want to roll up and track, because it's just kind of the same thing. We're talking about high level features because we're going to break them down. And one more.
Money sharing.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. I don't know what all those are.
We also have text message alerts as well, if that is also helpful.
Okay. I think you get the idea. I just want you kind of thinking about what the high level components are. Here's some that we had come up with. Things that you're going to have to do: customer account maintenance, so the things that the customer has to maintain, things that the bank has to maintain, like processing all your transactions and getting your balances ready for display. Bill pay is a big one. Balance transfers is another one, and everything under statements. So you can see these use cases are really, really high level. Once you have your epics identified, or the high level use cases, the next thing you're going to do is try to break them down into their component deliverables. So think of this part, instead of, if you're a project manager, doing a work breakdown structure and creating the task, you're out to do a feature breakdown structure and come up with the deliverable components that make up that feature, so that you can organize those into feature releases. So if a component is a part of a feature set that can be delivered as standalone functionality, if you're thinking of only customer account maintenance now as a component, and you were going to break that down, like let's say into the color yellow, what do you think would be some components of customer account maintenance? I'll write it down.
Okay, so
typing. I'm just going to say real quickly that this is something that you can really use sticky note to do to help you organize.
Yeah, that's why the picture. Sticky notes, if you're doing them virtually like we're doing, I've used Visio or PowerPoint and do the same thing. Like you just type it in and have people in the color that you've made the feature and start brainstorming. So this is it's not an exact science. It's science. It's a gut feel type of thing. Okay.
Cynthia, can you repeat the prompt just so people have a better understanding of what you're
looking for? Components of customer, some of the components. If you're going to develop a customer account maintenance feature, what would be some of the components that you would need to develop to complete that, or you would think would be a part of that?
This is like a customer's personal data, correct, Cynthia?
Yeah.
So we have bill pay.
Well, bill pay we said was a whole feature. So one of the things would be like maintaining your personal information could be one, right?
Right. We have address change of contact information.
Right. All of that.
Yep.
Address.
Notifications.
Right. Oops, I'm such a good typist.
Yes, you are.
Log in and out with history.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. That's got some security.
That could be under, once you start doing these, you can change the color, because maybe this would be
a security thing.
Yeah, but it's just brainstorming. That's what the whole point would be. And something else?
Let's see. Linked accounts or adding accounts.
Okay.
And resetting password.
Yeah. I have to do that all the time because I'm always forgetting mine.
Okay, that's good. I don't want to take too much time. We've got so much to cover. So for us, I said interpersonal account information. You can select and answer security questions, which also could go under security, but this would be your personal security question versus putting together all the security that you would need to run a banking app. The bank itself would have some components about creating product offers to get you to put more money into their bank, and maybe changing your tax form or statement options. So this is the kind of thing, and you would just put each one of those into a real sticky note or a virtual sticky note. The next thing you would do is to find what your minimum viable product is. And we've all heard about it, but we all don't 100% understand what it is. We've also heard the terms minimum marketable feature set and minimum business increment. All of those terms actually mean the smallest group of functionality that you can deliver when you're starting out that has meaning to your customer so you can test whether or not you're on the right track. Think of it as applying Pareto's 80-20 rule to priorities. So what would be the 20% that you could give to customers that would get them interested in your project? It's not perfect, yet they can use it, and you can start building a business and getting feedback and pivoting and adding functionality that may be functionality that you didn't think of when you built your plan. I'm not going to go through the get ready for work examples because some of you did it yesterday, but the whole point of this is normally I take you through listing all of the things you do in the morning when you get up. Like the alarm goes off and you may take a shower, some of you eat breakfast, some of you don't, you make coffee, maybe you buy coffee on the way to work. If you have kids, you got to feed your kids. If you have pets, you have to feed your pets. If you have things that you have to do around the house before you leave in the morning, maybe you need to check the traffic to see which way you're going to go to work. A whole litany of things. Brush your teeth, wash your hair, wash your hair, take a shower. But what happens when you wake up and you realize you forgot to set the alarm, or the alarm went off and you pushed snooze and you didn't wake up? You have 10 minutes to get ready. In that case, you may skip the shower, you may brush your teeth, you probably won't eat breakfast, you may have to make coffee to take it on the road because you won't have time to stop, things like that. Whatever you would have to do when you only have 10 minutes to get ready for work, that is your minimum viable product for getting ready for work. So think about that example with your own project and your own product, and you're developing something and you need to get ready for work with only 10 minutes. And those features that are that important that you would have to develop would be a good way to define what you think your minimum viable product is. Once you have broken down all your features into components, and you've really thought and put together a good idea of what your 20% that you're going to have to develop first, then you can take all those components and group them into releases. So creating a release plan is way more simplified than we probably do traditionally if you're doing projects right now. Once you can define all your features and all your components and brainstorm your minimum viable product in just a couple of hours and organize them by priority. And then the product owner themselves are the ones that would prioritize the groups for delivery with input from the team. You'll pick dates that you can deliver on a regular and frequent basis, like on a quarterly release schedule, and you can rework. That was hard to say. You can rework the high value groups so the team feels comfortable with the release dates. And a lot of people have said to me, well, what if you have continuous delivery to production? So in other words, when it's done, it just goes into production. We're not delivering to the outside world. I would still say, figure out what you need to deliver in a quarter, manage and track that, and also report that you've completed the feature sets by the release dates, because everything's about image and marketing, and even internal image and internal marketing are the same. And just because you plan initially doesn't mean that you wouldn't replan releases based on customer feedback every quarter. Okay, so now that you have a plan and you've organized your thoughts and you know what components you need to build in the next quarter and what are the high priority features that you need to get done for your minimum viable product, now you can write stories. But before you write stories, like anything else, get organized. Figure out what you're going to use for your Agile project management tool. Change the way you think to think about slices and not layers. Prioritize your first release epic components, because now you know what you're going to deliver, but what are you going to deliver first? What's the most important thing to see and feel and taste and touch in the real world? And decide if you need to conduct any research. Get the research, make a decision right away. When it comes to Agile tools, I know that if you're all sitting together, it might be, and you haven't done this before, it might be really tempting to manage your backlog on spreadsheets. I've seen a lot of people who write initial stories in Excel. Don't do it. Don't use everything on sticky notes, and don't try to do it manually. There's so many hosted packages that could cost as little as $25 a month for small teams. Just research a package, pick it, set it up, and then get started. I would normally ask you, but we're running kind of short on time, what packages you use. But in general, most people use Jira version 1 and Rally. So if you're new to Scrum and you're new to Agile, look up those 3 and pick one. The first mindset change that you have to think about is you've got to start thinking in slices instead of development layers. In traditional application development, it's like constructing a layer cake. First, we gather all the requirements.
Cynthia, I'm sorry. I want to stop you for just a second. We had a question come in about if there are any free options in the ones that you mentioned.
I don't, it changes all the time. I think version 1 might have a free option. I am not sure if Jira does. Rally's not my favorite, but so for me, I would look at Jira version 1, but if you have a small team, it's not very, even if you have to pay, it's not very expensive.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So generally, we gather all the requirements. Then we get an architect, and the architect designs the infrastructure, and then we build things out, and then we code and test, and then we QA everything. Then we do some regression, and then we get the business involved way up at the top, almost at the end. And then we magically think that everything's going to go according to plan, and we're going to release and have a big party. We all know that that doesn't work that way. If you're spending 3 months to 6 months gathering requirements, by the time you're done, your requirements that you took at the beginning may or may not be the same requirements. Basically, layers don't work because today's fast-paced economy, you can't afford to wait till all the requirements are known to start building your application. You can't afford to wait until all the development is complete and tested before showing your stakeholders or your customers. It's really time to throw out the old waterfall paradigm, and you need to begin thinking about building complete working slices of code, not fully baked layers. If you want to talk about slices, not layers, when I was at Intel, somebody showed me this, and it's on the internet. Just look, if you want to get it for yourself, look it up. It's Mona Lisa, iterative versus incremental. And we talk about incremental, and incremental is really tricky because you're building a full, complete thing one piece at a time. That assumes that if you start at the beginning and start putting together a puzzle, that everything's going to fit together when you're finished. And what we're talking about here, this may work if you're putting together a machine or you're building out infrastructure. But if you're building an application, it's better to start thinking iteratively, which is like putting together or building a painting. Think about the broad brush strokes first that you can build to make sure that your concept is sound. Then start adding little features to your component so that you can start to see it work, and then finally at the end you'll have a finished product. So when you're thinking about your MVP, if you can think about the iterative approach, about using broad brush strokes to get an idea about the full use of your application without necessarily building everything to complete perfection, because putting together a jigsaw puzzle with an unknown piece at the end that you may need to pivot is not always the best answer. So you really need to balance incremental versus iterative thinking. But regardless, either one is better than a complete development slice. For those of you who are a little bit technical, I'm going to give you a slices, not layers example. When I was at Nike and we had to rewrite our complete service architecture, it was very tempting to fall back on our waterfall ways and gather all the data elements about a product and come up with this huge service architecture and how we were going to write all this stuff. But instead, using the iterative approach, we said, you know what? We have an architecture that we want to use. What if we only sent a product ID and got back the description? That would prove that the architecture that we were using was working. Wow. So instead of having to get every single data element documented and organized into a set of services or microservices, all we did was send across an ID and get back a description. And that was a small story. That's an incremental piece of a larger component. Then, once we knew that worked, it was easy to go. We would break it down, our information, into component parts and negotiate with the people that we're using to figure out what was really important. And then when we kind of had an idea about that, we would stub it out with fixed data so we could test it to make sure that the format worked before we made a lot of queries against the main databases and all this other stuff. So the thinking had to change so that we could use broad brushstrokes to test out what we were thinking about building without spending a lot of time. So literally, you could be negotiating and come up with a little first contract and stub it out in the same sprint. You could do 3 of them at the same time and then decide what microservices you were going to build and move. So we're constantly implementing and changing after our customers used the information. And it was way powerful. We got everything done a lot more quickly than if we had tried to analyze all the data at once. Plus, when it's smaller, it's a lot easier to digest and think about. So now let's review what the story writing mindset really means. Stories perform a single function. They are not a component. They are a little piece of functionality. They're small enough that they can be completed within the sprint. So 2 weeks. So think about that. You're completing multiple stories in a 2-week period. The way you're defining the requirement has to be small. Stories have to be independent. You need to be able to move that story into production at the end of the sprint. Even if you don't, it still has to be ready. Completed stories can't leave the application in unstable state. So if you have a lot of people that rely on your application, especially if you're going to the outside world or other places within your business, you need to think about backwards compatibility. You may need to leave 2 versions or some if then else or something so that you can, well, people can be running your old version and your new version at the same time if they're not updated. And stories describe the user experience, not how to build the app. So that's why when you focus on the functionality, don't get bogged down by how it's going to happen. Each story is going to go through its own systems development life cycle. You're going to look at the requirements, you're going to do analysis and design, you're going to code, you're going to test, and you're going to have it accepted by the product owner before it's closed. So if you go straight to the spec and you change your mind, the whole story becomes invalid. If you find that happening, look at what your stories are actually talking about. Are they specifications or are they functional requirements? Another thing that you need to know when you're writing a story is what are you going to do if it doesn't work, and how do you know that the story does work? Acceptance criteria is optional if you look it up on the internet. But when you're in real life, knowing the answers to these 2 questions is not optional, because someone who didn't work on the story has to test it. So we need to understand what we're going to do if it works and if it doesn't work. Who writes the stories? In traditional Scrum, they say the product owner writes the stories because the product owner represents your customer. Since a story is a functional requirement that describes the what and not the how, we recommend, if you're working in an application environment, to pair, at least in the beginning, the product owner with some kind of business analyst, like the person on the team who wrote all the requirements in the past. So when you're first getting into Scrum, it's really difficult to expect someone who's never written a requirement in traditional project management to suddenly wake up and be able to write excellent user stories. So pairing that person with someone who's good at writing requirements really helps jumpstart your technique. And if you're doing technical teams, if you're working on a really technical team like the service architecture that I've been talking about, you definitely will probably have developers who write the stories. And this is where you really have to make sure that they're talking about the hows and not the whats. They're writing stories and not specs. I think if you've looked at anything Agile or looked up any documentation, this is the traditional story format for the story and acceptance criteria. It's really important that you understand who is going to use the function and what they want to do so that they can achieve some goal. Having that in mind really helps you identify what it is that they need to be able to do, and when it's finished, how they're going to show success or failure. So all of these parts need to be present when you write a story. So if we're looking at our customer account maintenance, we had the following components. The customer enters their personal information, they select and answer security questions, they could create product offers, and they can change their tax form options. We're running a little bit behind, so I'm going to just kind of move forward unless anybody has any questions with some candidate story titles for entering personal account information, since that's very important. They need to maintain, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're okay. I said right now we don't have any questions, so you're good to go.
Okay. So just along the lines of personal information, obviously we need some way to maintain it. They need some way to change their monthly statement options. A lot of banks allow you to have them paper versus electronic or email. A lot of banks also, you need to maintain your beneficiary or your emergency, like if something happens. Creating alerts like low account balance, whatever it is that you want to be alerted to. And as Gerri had talked about, retrieving, your username or password. So these are the things that are about you as a person. Here's some options that are candidate story titles. They're very small and they can be completed within a sprint, and they all roll up into the personal information. So thinking about the story that's behind maintaining your personal information, it's really simple. The customer's going to do it because they want the ability to change the information if it changes in their real life, because they want to be able to keep the system up to date and continue to receive their statements and product offers. So this is a really simple story. Maybe it's a little oversimplified, but it meets all the criteria. So as a customer, I want the ability to update the personal information of my account so I can keep the system up to date and continue to receive timely statements. If you're writing a story and you don't know why you need it, then maybe it's not part of your minimum viable product, or maybe you don't really understand the story. So the why you're writing it is very, very important. So how do we know that the story works? This is pretty simple. Acceptance criteria 1 would be something like, given that I've previously logged in, and you may or may not have the security done, so this is assuming that you're able to log in. When I access the update page, I'm able to update my first name, my last name, my address, my phone numbers, and my email addresses. somewhere either in the story requirement up here, the ability to update personal information, or in the acceptance criteria, you need to outline the major data elements that have to be present, or else somebody's not going to be able to test it. So depending on how you like to write stories, I like to put the data and everything, the more details, in the acceptance criteria and keep the story itself general enough that everybody kind of gets a feel for what's happening, even if they don't understand the entire story. And acceptance criteria 2, what do we do if it goes wrong? Given that I've updated my information, when I click save, the validated data is formatted correctly. And then if it is valid, I'm going to update the database. And if it's not valid, I'm going to display an error message. So when I'm done, I can move this story into production because I know what data elements I need to enter. I validated my data, and I know that I'm going to have either an updated database or a rejected transaction with an error message. Well-written stories ensure that everyone understands what the customer wants to do, why the customer wants to do it, how we're going to know it works, and how we're going to know what the system's going to how the system's going to react if something goes wrong. If these pieces aren't in the stories that you're writing now, go back, and with a little bit of clarification, I'm sure that you will start getting better results. Some of you may or may not have heard about the term spikes. Spikes are used when the team doesn't understand the requirement enough to write a story and code a solution. So if you're having trouble writing a story because you don't know like why the customer wants to do it, how you're going to tell it's done, or what you're going to do if it doesn't work, you may want to write a spike story. And the reasons that you do that is like maybe you're installing a new tool and you just want to have a few story points worth of effort to get familiar with the new tool before you start writing stories, because you can't size stories without understanding how long it takes to get something done. Or a lot of times if you do maintenance on your applications, you'll get a bug that comes into your backlog that is something that's been there for a really long time. It doesn't work. Nobody really knows why. And you want to spend some valuable quality time researching it before you design a solution. The important thing is that the acceptance criteria for a spike, either you learn the answer and you document it somewhere, or you have a hard stop because you don't want to go down a rat hole. I've seen some of these issues or bug research stories that without having a hard stop, they can go on and suck the whole team in. So as a Scrum Master, if you're a Scrum Master, you need to be aware of what's happening with your spike stories that are researched. Now that we have well-written stories and maybe a spike or two, it's time to groom them to make sure everybody understands them and assign a relative size. Even though everyone doesn't have input to story sizing, everyone should be at story grooming. You need to focus on the near term. A lot of methodologies will say, oh, you got to get a quarter's worth of stories written. I feel like things change as you start implementing. So really, when you're you may have some stories outlined, but you really only are going to groom stories for the next sprint. That way you can keep the meeting down to under it. That meeting should not take more than an hour. If it's taking longer, then the people who are running stories aren't running stories that people understand. Who provides input to story size? Well, the business analyst who assisted with the story writing would help explain some of the things if the product owner can't necessarily do it, because maybe some of them are a little more technical. The programmers are going to develop the story for sure, and the quality assurance people who are going to test the story. Sometimes things take longer to test than they did to code. So you really need to have both the developer and the quality assurance people involved. The Scrum Master and the Product Owner do not have a say in the story size because they are not developing and validating the story. If you have a lot of teams that are going to pull from one backlog, you need to invite everybody to grooming so everybody understands. If you're not familiar with story points, they're a relative sizing method that are not equal to ours in any way. They're based on a gut level of effort. And because of that, they don't hold the same value across teams. If you're not using t-shirt sizing, you're probably using what we call the Fibonacci sequence, which I found out is the series of numbers that if you put them together, create the nautilus conch shell shape. Each number in the sequence doubles the level of effort from the prior number. The beginning numbers for the Fibonacci sequence are listed here. I'm not going to read them. But the important thing is, as I told you earlier, it's really important so you don't go down a rat hole that even if you're doing a spike, you size spikes too, so that you can either close the story and right where you are, and then decide in the next sprint if you want to bring up the thing if you can't figure it out. They talk about relative sizing and the doubling and everything with the Fibonacci sequence, but nobody really tells you when you're starting out, what does that mean? What do these points mean? So if you start at the beginning, most people who are doing a 2-week sprint look at something, if it takes an entire sprint, it's an 8. That's pretty standard. So looking at that and thinking about the doubling, if something takes 1 or 2 days of effort, like you know that you're going to code it, test it, and it's going to be ready to be accepted by the product owner in a very short period of time, give it a 1 or a 2. If something is a half a week's worth of effort, doubling the 1 to 2 days or whatever, give it a 3. If something's going to take at least an entire week, around an entire week, give or take, give it a 5 and double that, it's an 8. If anything comes back where people are feeling it's a 13 or a 21, it's too big. You need to break it apart into smaller chunks. A very popular way of getting everyone to agree on a story size is using the technique called planning poker. There are even planning poker decks with the Fibonacci sequence on it or t-shirt sizes. Planning poker is a consensus building technique. It starts with the highest priority story. So that means before you come into sprint planning or story grooming, you need to know what your highest priority stories are. The highest priority story goes first. You read it out loud. If it's not understood, you update it. If everybody says it's too big, like a 13 or a 21, you break it down into smaller stories. You may not be able to do it in that session, so I suggest that you have your story grooming and sizing sessions at 2 days before your sprint planning. And you'll maybe, if it's something somebody wrote a long time ago and no one really remembers, you're going to have to move it into the backlog because we don't work on anything that isn't understood. Playing planning poker is a lot like playing rock, paper, scissors. You'll read a story, everyone understands it, and then either if you're all together, I'll have people like hold up their fingers for the number that they think it is. If I'm on a distributed team, I'll just kind of have everybody write into the comment box what they think it is at the same time. And then we'll discuss the highest and lowest for sure. We'll try to build consensus and we'll come up with a story size. If it takes more than 5 minutes to come to consensus on a story, no one really understands it. It may have to be rewritten, broken down, or come back for another grooming session. And you're going to repeat this for all the candidate stories. So by the end of playing planning poker and story grooming, everyone on the team that's why everybody needs to come, because then they'll have a good idea of what's coming in as a potential candidate for sprint planning. Right now, I think we could play a little planning poker. But basically, here's our story. So as the customer, I want the ability to update my information so I can continue to receive timely statements and product offers. Our acceptance criteria was that if I've logged in, when I access the update page, I'm able to update my data. When I click save, the data is going to be validated that it's formatted correctly. If it's valid, I'm going to update the database. If it's not, I'm going to display the appropriate error message. So Aubrey, it's time for everybody to wake up since we're almost done. And based on our sizing, do we think it's a 1 or a 2? Do we think it's a 3? Do we think it's a 5? Or do we think it's an 8? I just want people to kind of put in, we only have 32 people, so put in a number based on your gut.
Do you just want them to put it in the question box?
You could put, I don't know, you could put it in the chat. I don't know where it goes.
Yeah, let's do the question box because we're getting a couple responses in that way too. So I have a mix of answers, I guess you could say. I have 2 folks who have said 2. I have 3 folks who have said 3. 4 folks now who've said 3.
Okay.
1 who said 5. 1 who said 8.
Really? Okay.
Yes. 3 seems to be the most common answer.
How many did we get on that?
1, 2, 3, 4.
It doesn't have to be exact. Is
6.
it like 10?
6.
Huh?
6.
Okay.
So now 7.
Right. Okay. So in general, when I get these kinds of responses, a 2 and a 3 to me are about, the same. So if more people said it, if 6 people said 2 or 3, I'd say, like, which do you think, how are you leaning more or less? And I'd maybe ask a couple people why. The 5 and the 8, since you're not on speaker that I can't really talk to you, I would say, like, why do you think it's complicated? Why do you think that story would take 2 weeks for one person or to finish? And we would discuss that because maybe it's a testing issue. I just didn't see it. But in general, at the end, when I'm building consensus, I err on the side of too big. So let's say everybody was 2 or 3. I would just say I would put it at a 3. If one person was a 5 or an 8 and they couldn't convince the other people that it was bigger than that, it's probably more likely a 3. So remember, you're only going to be right half the time, but the important thing is that you have the discussion and you have all the facts in front of you, because there may be things that make that story an 8 that I personally haven't thought of. So everybody's feeling is valid. And the fact that you put it all up at the same time, like rock, paper, scissors, it minimizes the bias. So the important thing is to get people's gut feel for how big it is.
Do you just, do you add the points together for like UX, design layout, front end development, database work, and the back end? Is that how you?
No.
Okay.
No.
We had a question on that.
Each story is one story.
Perfect.
One set of points.
Okay.
Right. Because it'll be way bigger if you start adding all that stuff up. Then you might as well do hours, right? So the important thing is to make sure your stories are small, because you have to complete the whole thing. So you never want to bring in bigger than an 8. And if all your stories are 8, then you're really not thinking small enough. So after sizing all your candidate stories, you're ready for sprint planning, because you know what the priority is, you've sized them all. And then if you may have to come back in a couple of days, some stories that needed to be rewritten. So maybe you'll groom 1 or 2 stories at sprint planning. But in general, if you do your story grooming and sizing a couple of days ahead of time, these OMG moments, you'll have enough time to take care of that and come to sprint planning with really good idea about what you're going to get done. So a lot of information. And wow, I tried to get it done with 10 minutes to spare so that people could ask questions. So if you have any other questions even after, you can check out our website, gsd.guru. We have the first 6 chapters of our book online. We have like a ton of blog posts that may answer some of those questions. I'm sure I know I've written about story writing and acceptance criteria. So even on this topic, if you did a search, you could probably find some more information. Or if you want some up close and personal stuff, you can email me at cynthiak@gsd.guru or Gerri at GerriG. She's local, so maybe she'd meet you for coffee at gsd.guru. So I'm in Austin, Texas. So if any of you are coming in from Austin, you can email me and I'll have coffee with you. But of course, the phone works from anywhere. And Gerri, you got anything else?
No, I think that's really good. I think as Cynthia was saying, there are a number of blog posts. If you're interested in learning about prioritizing some of the stories you have in your backlog, there are methods to do that. We just have a lot of information on the website that I think you'll find useful. And we've had a lot of fun putting it together.
Perfect. Yep. Well, thank you both so much, Cynthia and Gerri. Like Cynthia mentioned, we'll go ahead and take some time for questions right now. Just as a reminder, if you do have a question, please be sure to type your questions into the question box, and that is located on the GoToWebinar control panel. Perfect. So one question came in. Can you give your thoughts on getting a PMP certification and if you feel it can help a mid to senior level PM in the digital tech advertising space?
Oh, I can answer that one, I think. I personally think that the PMP is really a useful thing to have. It's tough to get, but it's a very useful thing to have. Many companies are requiring it now, although I'm seeing also kind of a downtrend in that in some places. But digital tech advertising, I think digital tech, yes. And it depends on if you're a project manager, absolutely. My best advice would be to take a 1-week course, and that usually helps most people be able to pass the test because it is pretty tough. It's one of the toughest ones I ever took. And I took the LSATs.
So, I mean, the other thing is the PMP is not about Agile. There is an Agile certified professional through the Project Management Institute, but I don't recommend it. Most people, if you're going to be a Scrum Master, is to go through Scrum Alliance, the CSM. That's why we have our CSM. So in the Agile space, something from the Scrum Alliance, or is it the agilealliance.org or something like that? But the Scrum Alliance is where we've gone through, and that's what people look for in Agile environments. But if you don't know anything about managing projects, the only thing is it's a little bit confusing because a project manager and a Scrum Master are completely different roles. We do have a blog post called The Difference Between Project Manager and Scrum Master, so you may want to look it up before you make your decision as to where you want to spend your money.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out to either of us if you want some more information on anything like that.
Yeah, for sure.
Perfect. So I just had a question. Will there be a link for this webinar? Yes, there will. So I will be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who has joined us today. And in that email, there will be a recording of today's webinar for you to reference back to. So you will have that at your disposal. I think we have covered all of the, oh, hold on. Yes, we do offer webinars often. We have another webinar coming up next week on the 24th. It is about being on target and on plan for retirement. So our subjects do vary. And so
I'll be all over that one.
Yes, please feel free to check the Alumni Association event calendar that is online. We have all of the webinars that are up there, and we have them every week from now until the end of May. We'll take a little bit of a break in the summer, and then we will pick it back up in the middle of August. So hopefully that will...
Aubrey, if I may, pimp our training. We do offer a Scrum in 1 day workshop that we guarantee if that you have us, start learning with us in the morning, you'll know Scrum by the afternoon. And if you have any interest in something like that, please do drop us a line and we'll give you information.
Perfect. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, and it says on this thing that if you want a copy of the slideshow, email us and we'll get you a PDF. So, yeah.
Wonderful.
I didn't specifically mention it, but I've been staring at it. I'm like, oh, I didn't say it.
And I'll include that in the follow-up email as well, just so you have their email addresses to reach out to Cynthia and Gerri.
Excellent.
Perfect. Well,
and of course, there's one more thing that's required, and that is go Terps.
That's right. Yes. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Have a wonderful day. And yes, go Terps.
Thanks all.
You.
Bye.
Bye-bye.